Dear Minister Besimi, dear Minister Nurdini, dear Governor Angelovska-Bejoska, dear representatives from financial institutions, private sector, ministries, academia, and civil society. It's my great pleasure to open this year's UN Annual Conference on an interesting, important, and relatively new topic in the country, financing for Sustainable Development Goals, or SDG financing. The Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development calls for action to create a better world for us, for the future generations, by stepping up interventions on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Agenda 2030 also calls for a greater focus of governments and financial markets in ensuring more and more efficient financing for sustainable development. And rightly so, because achieving prosperity for the people, green and inclusive growth, democracy, and healthy environment for all, as inspired by Agenda 2030, comes with a significant cost. In many countries in the world, as in North Macedonia, the financial resources are scarce, especially having in mind the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19. To achieve these ambitions, it's important to shift the existing financial flows, both public and private, towards carefully selected interventions that will accelerate the development in a sustainable way and avoid instruments that create negative externalities. But how to achieve such shifts in major financing flows? Many governments, financial institutions, and companies around the world are currently thinking and working on this, and everyone can potentially do more and better. Governments, through targeting public expenditures, setting tax policies and subsidies, as well as through their potential to mitigate risk for private sector investments in new areas, can play an important role in incentivizing the private sector towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Creating innovative financial tools allows to blend and thereby increase finance from multiple sources to specific policy aims for the benefit of the people and businesses. Banks and institutional investors, such as pensions, insurance and investment funds, and other private investors, also have an important role to play by targeting their services towards companies that pay due attention to good environmental, social, and corporate governance practices. Private sector is a key partner that can accelerate the shift towards a sustainable path. Advancing the core business activities towards clean and energy-efficient production processes and greater reliance on renewable energy can make a significant impact on our environment. Ensuring good working conditions for its employees, fair relations with the partners in the supply chain, strong and gender-inclusive corporate governance, as well as a drive towards innovation and technical upgrade, would add value and strengthen profitability in the long run. It would also make a tremendous impact on our society and prosperity. It's important that companies recognize this and find the most adequate ways to implement it. Small steps do count. Finally, the international community in the country, including international financial institutions, also have a role to play in supporting government and private sector in this endeavor, but both through co-financing, but even more so through sharing knowledge and experience. The United Nations in North Macedonia is ready to support and cooperate with all stakeholders on this important topic. UN agencies are already working with the government on issues such as climate and environment finance, gender-based budgeting, and financing for health and social protection. Today's conference aims to open the discussion on SDG financing by taking stock of already ongoing efforts in the country, shedding light on current global developments, and identifying the next steps needed to continue redirecting existing financing towards sustainability and better quality of life for all. You may hear a number of buzzwords today, from green bonds, SDG budget tagging, to risk management and guarantees, from ESG standards and responsible banking to sustainability reporting. That's why I'm very happy that with us today are key policymakers, bankers, experts, and international organizations on the two panels that will be able to highlight these approaches that reflect the global initiative to accelerate sustainable development financing. I'm even more happy that we have an audience of colleagues from banking, pension and insurance funds, the stock market, regulators, private companies, as well as from government and international institutions, who also bring strong expertise or interest to contribute to this topic. So I very much look forward to today's discussion. On that note, I will close my remarks and invite you to listen to the video address of Deputy Prime Minister Batici.
Dear Permanent Resident Coordinator, Ministers Besimi and Nureddini, esteemed Governor Angelska Bežovska, esteemed colleagues from the ministries, financial institutions, private sector and international community. The government of North Macedonia, as a signatory of the Sustainable Development Goals and as a country which aims for membership in the European Union, places a great deal of significance on sustainability. The Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals include topical challenges in countries that require significant resources to be implemented. That is why the mobilization of financial resources that contribute to sustainability are a key challenge to ensure progress to 2030. The need for more funding aimed at sustainable development has been set as a global challenge at the outset of Agenda 2030. The resources needed to ensure green and equitable development are larger than the scope of the budget of any individual country. Also, the benefits and the responsibility for achieving sustainable development is shared by all stakeholders in society. So, if we want to have sustainable development, it is key to include all stakeholders in society, including financial markets and the private sector. The challenge of financing the SDGs and achieving the SDGs by 2030 is all the more acute now in view of the COVID crisis that caused negative effects not only in public health but also in the economy and also placed a large burden on public finance. But this does not mean that we cannot jointly achieve progress in the sustainable development of our country. Quite the opposite, by specific measures for stimulating investment and redirecting funds towards sustainable goals in the public as well as private sector, make it possible to improve economic development, to offer well-being for many people, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and improve quality of healthcare and education. I am pleased that North Macedonia already has a number of initiatives in that regard, especially in the area of green finance, from introducing new financial instruments aimed at sustainability, such as, for example, the Future Energy Efficiency Fund, the Green Finance Fund, and also involvement in regional and global funds such as the Western Balkan Investment Fund, the Global Climate Fund, and new policies and instruments within the budget that aim towards sustainable development, such as the environmental tax and reviewing the possibility for CO2 emission permits, a reduction of risks and damage in agriculture, as well as loans and guarantees. It is good that the banks are already offering targeted loans for improving energy efficiency. I am further pleased to see several multi-million projects for construction of renewable energy projects, such as the Stipian Solar Park, which will be one of the largest solar parks and is being built as a strategic investment in the country. Certainly, there is a lot more room for further redirecting of existing cash flows, especially from private capital. Banks, pension funds, investment funds, and insurance companies can have a significant contribution towards shifting the private sector towards sustainable operations by redirecting their funds to companies that fulfill the sustainable operation criteria, such as good environmental, social, and corporate governance. I am pleased that at today's conference we will hear from top experts and presenters in this area who I'm sure will have a lot to contribute. I wish you a successful conference and I hope that this conference will produce relevant conclusions that will help set up policies for accelerated funding of green economic development of the country. Thank you.
Let me now invite Marian Petrescu, professor at University American College Skopje and economist at Finance Think, to provide a short presentation of the new study on SDG financing landscape in North Macedonia.
Esteemed resident representative Ms. Duđak, esteemed ministers in the government cabinet of North Macedonia, esteemed governor of the Central Bank, Angelska Bežovska, esteemed representatives of the financial sector, international organizations. The Office of the Resident Coordinator, UN Resident Coordinator, worked on analysis and mapping the landscape for implementing the Sustainable Development Goals in North Macedonia in order to open a productive debate on this subject, and this topic has not been sufficiently represented in public discourse. The study that undertakes this mapping, analysis, regional comparison, and analysis of existing subsidies in the context of sustainable funding is in front of us, and my role is to give a brief overview. As Ms. Duđak emphasized, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development aims at a sustainable transformation of society and its model of production and consumption, and this transformation requires a change in thinking and doing. Reformatting of subsidies, public policies, and application of technologies which are more energy efficient and resource efficient. Enormous investments are needed to create sustainable infrastructure and production methods with low carbon content and high efficiency that would achieve this transformation. Hence, funding is key for implementation of the Agenda 2030 and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. These constitute the basic framework for funding the implementation. Governments, international financial institutions, and private financial markets should allocate sufficient resource flows into sustainable investment. Sustainable finance is expanding, and we are witnessing the expansion of innovative financial instruments and green bonds related to the SDGs. Private market participants, especially institutional investors, are also changing their approach by integrating environmental, social, and governance factors in their models. In the assessment of the funding for SDGs, the globally accepted methodology starts from the classification of domestic and international, private and public sources in order to obtain a big picture of the total available set of financial flows, which is an important step to design incentives that would direct such investment flows towards sustainable development goals. Domestic public finance has a principal place because they constitute a dominant fraction of the available financial flows, and among those, certainly tax revenues play a major role. Namely, they are the principal source of funding, and on the slide you can see the situation in our country.
We see that they were stagnating throughout the years, and in some periods there is also a decline. From comparative perspective, on the right side of the slide, you see that North Macedonia is positioned in the group of countries with low share of these tax revenues as percentage of the GDP. The reasons for such situation can be multiple. Crucial here is the size of the informal economy and a full contingency of tax exemptions, whereby the effective tax rates are quite lower than the nominal rates. Here you see collected revenues from income tax on the left side. In the middle you see social contribution, and on the right side you see revenues from value-added tax. So the lower lines that you see here is what is actually the effective collection of these taxes. even though this funding is crucial for the SDGs, as the Deputy Prime Minister said in his statement, that this needs to be shifted towards the SDGs. Another important factor are the domestic private finances, both in globally but also in North Macedonia. The banking has the dominant role here. Credits in terms of the GDP in 2020 were 53.6%. And those are financed from a growing and stable deposit base. The new contingent of loans annually is up to 350 million euros, and this is a solid base for adding the public sources of funding. Such finance from banking is still very limited when it comes to financing the entrepreneurship and small and medium enterprises, because banks still have conservative policies about loans. However, in this regard, there is also a small contingent of non-banking financing from other financial institutions, which accounts to 30 million euros annually. In this context, let's not forget the financial support that comes from public or mixed sources.
Financial support coming from public or mixed sources, so public-private, as well as public-private partnerships, which unfortunately are still with a low degree of utilization, while the rest of the support comes from the Development Bank of North Macedonia and the Innovation Fund. The third set include international public finance, which is still dominated by international borrowing. So we see that the dominant portion of international borrowing are funds coming from euro-denominated bonds, approximately 2/3, and the remaining third are multilateral lenders, where most of the funds come through institutions from the World Bank Group. The second important part in this segment is official international assistance, which has a diminishing role in North Macedonia. And the last contingent are international private funds, and the methodology here counts foreign direct investment, and another segment of borrowing by the private non-financial sector, as well as remittances from abroad. I would say that the role of foreign direct investment is important, but we know that they vary over the years, and here we are calculating an average of around 300 million euros per year. And for remittances, we took a conservative estimate, which is reflected in the balance of payments of around 200 million euros per year. But we know that this number is probably underestimating the actual flows, because so much of it comes in through informal channels.
To sum up, this financial package in North Macedonia amounts to 5.3 billion euros annually, which is almost 50% of the GDP. On the right side, you can see a summary what I previously mentioned. 3/3 of this finance is the public domestic finance, with a dominant share of the budget funds. 330 million refer to the private domestic finance, public international finance, 230 million euros, and private international finance around 660 million euros. So what is key here is to be aware of the finance landscape in North Macedonia, but also to open the debate starting from here. That is, how is this directed towards the sustainable development and what we can do in this context. Just briefly, on this slide, I will mention several existing innovative instruments. Most of them were mentioned by the Deputy Prime Minister in his video address. These are existing instruments and which are actually channelized funds for the realization of the SDGs. That is the investment framework for Western Balkan, which enables combined financing through loans, grants, etc. Then we have the guarantee facility, which enables guarantees and counter guarantees for the financial intermediaries in Western Balkan. Also, the fund for green growth was already mentioned. Then we have also the regional program for energy efficiency and the initiative of the European Investment Bank for economic resilience. These are all regional initiatives, but the national governments are also taking their own activities and a range of instruments which are helping the sustainable development. One part of them belong to the group of taxes and state aid, such as green taxes. Serbia is a country that recently introduced the eco-tax for the companies, depending to which extent they contribute to pollution. But such discussions are held in other countries, including North Macedonia, and of course the group of subsidies that help the transition. In this, we have this in North Macedonia, such as replacement of fossil fuels with inverters. And the second big group refers to instruments which enable the borrowing. In this case, we speak about bonds with specific goal in the context of the green transition. Example for this are the green bonds. Serbia is also ahead of all countries. They issued 7 years green bond worth 7 billion euros, which is below the rate that the country is paying for the ordinary bonds. And at the end of this study, we also make an analysis in the context of the subsidies in North Macedonia, even though we face the challenge of lack of a register of state aid or state assistance. With the support of World Bank, now this register is being designed, but in general we did mapping of the main groups of subsidies, such as agricultural subsidies, which are the largest, 115 million euros annually. Then we have subsidies for salaries, for foreign companies, for domestic companies, and also financial support for investments. On the next slide, you will see our conclusion. Even though many of these subsidies can be related to the SDGs, yet we concluded that those can be refined. That is, they can have more environmental and corporate practices for governance. This is the mapping that I mentioned in the context of the SDGs. On the right side of the slide, we want to show you that we have identified over 100 lines of state aid, and we actually compared them to the SDGs. In conclusion, most of these state aid programs can be related to the SDG number 8, that refers to decent job and economic growth. In the same context, part of the programs can be also related to the SDG number 9, that refers to industry, innovation, and infrastructure. The second group are the programs for state aid, which can be related to the SDG number 1 for poverty reduction, quality education, and reduced inequalities. And the last group are the programs for state aid, which can be related to the 2 SDGs that refer to climate and energy. These are not that prominent, but there are still important programs at the Ministry of Environment and Physical Planning and the Ministry of Economy which are in fact helping the green transition.
The study concludes with a large set of recommendations for the government cabinet, the international community, and the private sector. I will mention only a few of these recommendations. So, of course, for the government, the important recommendation remains that in the short to medium term, there need to be reforms on both the revenue and expenditure side of the budget. I did not elaborate the revenue side much, but it certainly is important, and there's more about it in the study. So certainly how we administer revenues is important, and of course the administration should be adjusted to reflect the national sustainable development goals. In terms of borrowing, the country should orient itself more towards alternative financial instruments, and I already mentioned some of them in the part about innovative financial instruments, and to work on establishing new mechanisms such as multi-partner funds or reduction of risks for private sector investment. With regard to the international community, it is key for this whole process of allocating of funds to be supported both by expert assistance and supplementing the funding framework. And you see some of the more specific recommendations on the slide, and also the private sector, which we treat extensively during this conference. And of course, we expect that the private sector would take some steps, and regulators are important here to encourage the supervisory entities, so the central bank for the commercial banks and other regulatory supervisory bodies for other financial institutions to make investments in sustainable development. Certainly, institutional investors and banks might adopt and apply sustainability standards, and here I would like to particularly emphasize the good environmental, social, and corporate governance standards, as well as the principles for responsible banking, insurance, and investments. And the private sector should, of course, implement good practices in its business models, which would include adopting the universal human rights principles, labor standards, environmental standards, and anti-corruption efforts. So I would stop there, and I hope that during the two panels we will have opportunities to elaborate more on the messages that were mentioned. Now I would like to invite the panelists and the moderator from the first panel to come up to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, dear UN Resident Coordinator, High Representatives of UNDP and World Bank, Your Excellencies. It's a great pleasure to moderate the first panel of today's conference, titled Sustainable Public Finance: How can innovative finance, taxes and subsidies incentivize greater investment in sustainability? For a second year, governments are preoccupied with health and socio-economic emergencies. And this is no longer a normal dynamic paddling, but wild water canoeing for policymakers. And at some point, one should step out from the river and allocate some time to think strategically. So we thank for today's event to the organizers, the United Nations agencies, for the rare event to remind us that governments must not forget long-term sustainability concerns. Unlike the EU conditionality and the EU accession agenda, even though without attached conditions and promised pre-accession structural funds, the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development 2030 has attracted prominent attention by policymakers because it's a long-term development agenda that is less legalistic but more prosperity-centered vision of human development. Our panel will discuss sustainable public finance, aiming to provide the right incentives to building a resilient and sustainable economy. We will discuss these topics with Mr. Fatmir Besimi, Minister of Finance, Mr. Nasser Noureddini, Minister of Environment and Physical Planning, Mr. Massimiliano Paolucci, Country Director at the World Bank, and Mr. Armen Grigorian, UNDP Resident Representative. Welcome to the panel, and without further ado, I would like to ask the Minister Besimi. We have seen many strategic documents, plans aiming to accelerate economic growth. What makes the recently launched Growth Acceleration Plan by the government and the Ministry of Finance different? What are the main objectives and how will you ensure its effective implementation?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Alexander. First of all, I want to congratulate the organizers and also the UNDP and other who are contributing to this event today. In terms of the challenges, as you correctly put it, the biggest challenge in terms of leadership or in the context of managing certain situations or challenges actually is how we will coordinate these short-term urgent needs and should not focus the long-term goals. So it's really a big challenge. So in that respect, these kind of documents that we are talking, and you refer to the last one on Growth Acceleration Plan, actually aims to combine these agendas. Actually, while we are trying to manage in terms of the public finance now and economy growth, I would like to say that actually what this document helps us is in terms of on the time when we need to support the economy from during the crisis, from the implications of the pandemics, then now the energy crisis and other implications. We also face the challenge of fiscal consolidation and what our interventions in the market during the crisis, how to make sure that they are consistent with market principles. So these documents gives us that opportunity to focus on three goals. One is to accelerate growth from what we used to have in the last 10 years of 2.5% growth on annual average to above 5% for the next 5 years. The second goal is to how we reach this is by increasing investments, both public and private investment. And the third is to, at the same time, to have a fiscal consolidation in midterm. So how this will work? The magic of this is just what was presented here is introducing innovative financing in order to make sure that we mobilize also private capital in investments in the public sector as well. And this clearly based on market principles. So we make sure that we will not have a negative impact on the functioning of the market economy. So this is what we actually are trying. Maybe we will have also opportunity to refer back to certain other questions that might be raised. But what is important, what are the projections, so, and how we think will be the transmission mechanism on this. in addition to the classical instruments that we have in terms of the financing from the public sector, introducing new innovative instruments, some of them were mentioned here, but also how we leverage from the private sector to increase total investment. So in the next 5 years, actually through this plan we aim to increase GDP around 35%, and then which is in nominal terms is around 57%. And this assumes that investments will be increased, I'm talking in cumulative terms, in the next 5 years, about 62%, 66%, and exports about 72%, 27% consumption. All these figures talking in cumulative terms for 5 years, but also how we manage this is by also imposing, increasing the productivity about 15% and net wages about 13%. So what does this mean, these numbers in terms of the economy and the policies? This means that when we promote investments, it means that also we have the priorities, strategic priorities, which are in compliance and consistent with strategic development goals. These are the digital transformation, green economy, inclusiveness, physical infrastructure, human capital development, and social cohesion. Some of the priorities that we have been, as a government, presented and identified and promoted. So this is what the plan is about, and then having the innovative instruments and also the framework for project management in the country, about the life cycle of the management, and the instruments on the budget, which is ongoing on the parliament, the discussion. We have introduced the new instruments like green bonds that we will issue next year, the so-called project-based bonds, development bond, and the inflation index bonds. So these are the borrowing instruments, but also through Development Bank, the Fund for Innovation and Technological Development, also transformation of the Bureau for Regional Development into a fund for local and regional development, and other instruments. We aim to leverage from bundling investment from public funds, international organization and financial institutions, but also, most important, attracting private capital, private institutional investors, and others. So this is the concept of the next 5 years, how we plan to accelerate growth and through a cycle of investment boost in our economy. So thank you.
Thank you. Before we move to the next panelist, I would kindly ask the participants to ask questions online. They will be delivered to us during the second half of the panel. Since we are talking about financing SDGs, financing growth, a significant part of this growth acceleration plan is devoted to the green agenda, to the green financing. So I would like to ask Minister Nureddini about the priority environmental issues and initiatives at the Ministry of Environment. What is the likelihood for the country to be able to meet the target to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 51% below the 1990 levels by 2030 in accordance with the Paris Agreement? What is the current thinking at the Ministry of Environment, which received higher budget resources for the next year?
Thank you, Professor. First of all, I'd also like to thank the organizers for the event today, and good morning to the co-panelists, dear colleague, dear Minister. First of all, I'm not sure if you sat me strategically right in front of this 5 denar number. It's actually 15 dinars, by the way, per plastic bag. It's not 5 dinars. Or maybe it's just a big coincidence. I think it's very likely. The reason we are the ones that worked together with the UNDP in creating the strategy, but we didn't do it alone. We worked together with all the other institutions. It's not just the Ministry of Environment when we speak about achieving these targets. It's the whole country, it's all the institutions, but mainly it is also including the private sector. because the majority of the investments that will need to be made to achieve these targets will be coming from the private sector and from us individually as consumers. Because if we do not change our mannerism and the way we consume, we're not going to be able to achieve those targets either. Of course, the key challenge when we speak about climate change and achieving these targets is the key challenge is energy and moving away from the conventional production of energy. And of course, we're all aware that over 60% of our energy is being generated by coal. So moving away from the coal generation, the coal thermal power plants is the biggest key. Furthermore, of course, we are also very focused on the mobility. Excuse me. The mobility. Our fleet is very old. We all know that approximately the average age of the cars in our country are over 18, 19 years, sadly. But that is the situation we find ourselves in. Furthermore, as you already heard from the Minister, he said there's different programs being subsidized from the government through loans. And if I'm not wrong, I believe it's the World Bank in this one, or is it EBRD? I apologize for the energy efficiency, which will be supporting the municipalities to invest in energy efficiency in general. So it's not something that we've actually targeted. It's not something that we handed in because we think we're going to be one of the cool countries, because we were actually one of the first countries to hand it in, by the way. It's a strategy that's been thought out very thoroughly. There's 63 measures that need to be taken to achieve that. And we're quite sure we can do it if we have the right financing in place, if we create the right motivation for the private sector. And the motivation won't come out of pure free goodwill. We all know that. Private companies have shareholders. Shareholders want to see profits. However, reforms will be creating that motivation. One of the things, necessity will drive innovation as well. So when we speak about this, and one of the other things maybe we should be looking at, and this is something we're hopefully going to speak about in the future with the Ministry of Finance, because in general the public procurement process needs to be reformed. In our country, that is one of the things that holds us back a lot. A lot of the investments we're trying to make, as you mentioned, we have an increased budget. What we've encountered, unfortunately, is that a lot of this process takes a lot of time. It consumes a lot of time, and the end of the year comes very quickly, and your budget gets taken away, rightfully so, by the Ministry of Finance, if you don't realize it. So we need to reform that, and while we reform it, we potentially need to think about adding green public procurement in there as well, in order to motivate the private sector to be more social, to have the corporate social responsibility scheme in place, in order to get more points when they apply in public tenders. This maybe will be a reform and a motivation for the private sector to become more environmentally friendly, socially aware about their surrounding, and they will get more points when they participate in public procurement projects. Thanks.
Thank you. And international development partners have been heavily involved in most of these reform efforts, because most structural reforms take time, and their payoff is in the medium and long term. So many reforms are politically unpopular. But still, the international development partners are willing to accept the challenge and support governments to address these important issues. Let's say the World Bank is involved in areas from low productivity, private sector productivity, to human capital formation, fighting poverty, but also addressing the country needs to adapt to climate change. So I would like to ask Mr. Paolucci about the main challenges in managing the transition to a low-carbon economy. What is the World Bank expertise and attitude towards this adjustment, which can be very painful if the actors do not react?
Thank you very much, Professor. And again, let me echo the fellow panelists in thanking the organizers, the UN coordinator, and for this invitation. And let me also share my pride of being here in this very distinguished panel with ministers and UNDP representatives. So I'm going to focus on actually three aspects of the transition applied to the case of North Macedonia, which are, in our views, particularly critical when thinking about decarbonizing the economy, promoting green investment, and at the same time managing the risks of green investments. And these are fiscal policy, other sector policies, and then the risks associated to both. So when you look at fiscal policy has an important, a key role in promoting the transition. And promoting the transition towards greener investment, but also investments that adequately manage aspects related to climate adaptation and mitigation. So tax reforms are the main instrument to introduce those elements in policy, in public policy, that would allow this transition. And if you look at the taxation system in North Macedonia and taxation framework, you see that the current environmental taxation includes excises, VAT, and tariffs. But these are not well aligned to the EU acquis communautaire. And that's an issue. If you think about the excises, for example, for most of the energy products are subject to excises, but the level of the excises is below the Energy Taxation Directive. Also VAT, unlike what prescribed by the EU VAT Directive, some energy products are either VAT exempt or they benefit from VAT deductions, and this is again not aligned with the EU acquis. So, addressing this issue would be key in advancing the green agenda in the country. Now, when you think also another aspect of taxation is pricing pollution, and the existing pricing mechanism in North Macedonia do not adequately reflect the cost of environmental damages. If you think about how important this is to help increase fiscal revenues, to decrease greenhouse emissions, but also to promote better air quality management, you understand how it is important to address this issue of pricing the negative externalities correctly. More so, having in mind the NDCs, the renewed NDCs that the government has pledged to achieve by 2030. In North Macedonia, pricing pollution can be achieved relatively easy, actually, by looking at the excise systems. So excise are really the easiest way to do it. They are rather, from an economic point of view, uncontroversial. They allow to actually generate income that not only address the externalities, but also help protect those who will be mostly affected by the increase in excises. But apart from taxation and taxation policy, other aspects, other sector policies can help advance decarbonization of the economy. And let's think about, for example, capturing methane from waste management. This is actually, it's expensive, but it's something that would allow the country to actually benefit from a reality, which is waste management. Let's think about the introduction or strengthening of public transportation through alternative modalities in cities, in big cities. That's, again, it would allow to decarbonize the economy while at the same time strengthening the social fabric of cities by simply better connecting different neighborhoods of the cities. And businesses can be part of the solution here, as Minister Bessimi introduced through the Growth Acceleration Plan. But the Growth Acceleration Plan requires a non-trivial amount of public resources that, in our view, could be leveraged by simply shifting the budgeting away from non-productive non-productive expenses, and by eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. Let me conclude by focusing on the risks associated to the decarbonization, because moving towards a green economy is what we aspire, but it's not cost-free, it's not pain-free, it's not risk-free. And some of the risks that we have identified are those that I mentioned before on excises. I said from an economic point of view, they're really not, working on through exercises is not controversial, but from a political point of view, we understand it is difficult. But it's by introducing predictability in policies and actually being clear about the message and being clear about also the advantages of the resources, for example, generated through a better excise policy, protecting those that are the most vulnerable, and having resources to generate green jobs, that these risks can be mitigated. There are also risks related, for example, to the transition away from fossil fuels and having to import even more energy than the country imports right now. So having a clear policy, a predictable policy there, with a clear set of incentives for the production of clean energy and electricity to be reviewed over the medium term and long term, that's important. In essence, risks, benefits, but that's the way to go. And it implies bold political decisions, but economically grounded. Thank you.
Mr. Nureddini wanted a short intervention.
It's a panel. I hope you allow me to actually reflect on those comments. First of all, I'd like to actually say yes, I agree with Mr. Paolucci. Second of all, I'd like to also state that we as a government have proposed an excise on fossil fuels. It's only been sitting in Parliament for 5 months, unfortunately. Hopefully it will pass it sooner enough. So we are actually, as a government, making those bold decisions, as you mentioned. Very courageous as well. Third thing, two more things I quickly want to mention on the pricing and pollution. Yes, our law on climate action is ready. We're currently harmonizing with all institutions so we can be ready to do that. We're also looking at including potentially a carbon taxing method on it. However, we also need to be aware of our own industry. We don't want to put a disadvantage to our industry if we do that, because at the same time, one of the largest CO2 emitters in our country is our own state-owned energy production company, ESM. We need to balance that as well. Thirdly, when you mentioned the waste management, we are actually, thankfully, with the support of the Minister of Finance, we are looking to take out a loan of over 50 million euros to invest in international standards on our landfills, and gas capture is one of the things. And it's also foreseen in our NDC that we decrease our greenhouse gas emissions through building those landfills. Thanks.
Thank you. The discussion on the risks reminds me on the former Mexican president, Ernesto Zedillo. He was asked by journalists, what if we do not achieve the Millennium Development Goals? And he said, well, shame on us. We'll have to revise the goals and double our efforts. In that spirit, I would like to ask Mr. Grigorian how to link the financing of SDGs with the priorities and the budget process. Are there some experiences or suggestions how to give more leverage to and increase the likelihood of achieving these SDGs? How to devote more financing resources and have more effective use?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Facilitator, distinguished panel, ladies and gentlemen. In UNDP, in this region of Europe and Central Asia, there are few areas that we have experience in working on developing financing. UNDP corporate offer on SDG financing provides an opportunity to consolidate our knowledge and experience. There are 3 specific areas in which UNDP is focusing its work on SDG financing in North Macedonia. Addressing public sector financing for SDGs, working with partners to scale up SDG financing, and promoting private sector sustainability through SDG impact. I think some, if not all, of these focus areas have been already mentioned by panel members earlier. Of course, we all live in very turbulent times, COVID, economic challenges. Now I also read in the news that the government has extended the energy crisis announced, I think, about 3 weeks ago. In the face of all these societal, environmental, climate, economic, and health challenges, we are working to support the government of North Macedonia to prepare its new long-term national development strategy. And our aim and our hope is that these considerations, including for SDG budgeting, including for more risk-aware budgeting, are going to be reflected in the country's long-term development plan. The strategy that we plan to work with the government outlines in new organic budget law that should soon be adopted, as far as I understand. Finally, it can help policymakers to better allocate resources towards long-term goals and help budget users. I would also like to highlight one area of SDG financing and look at it through the prism of disaster risk reduction. We have had our discussion with the representative of the World Bank here before on this, and I believe, and this is also my professional background as well, that it is important that UNDP's work in this country also happens, as I said, to be my primary area of expertise. Investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience is one of the 4 priority areas of Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And I think this is, North Macedonia is a party to this agreement, and I think this is something that in public and private investment in disaster risk reduction through structural and non-structural measures is something that we hopefully will be also promoting. During the recently held European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction, which government of North Macedonia has also attended in Portugal, many participants expressed concerns about the unsustainable economic losses from disasters and emphasized the needs for greater public and private investment. On disasters, also linking it to the climate agenda. As we know, up to 90% of disasters now have climate origins. They are related to changing climate. And this is something that definitely makes the climate and disaster agenda very much interlinked. The roadmap for disaster resilient European and Central Asian region by 2030 was adopted at the European Forum in Portugal last week. And it identifies specific areas to provide support in governments. And like the SDGs, this is also a global agenda in terms that both SDGs and both the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction addresses not only developing countries but also developed countries. And I think this is one of the key areas that we would like to emphasize. UNDP recently commissioned a report in North Macedonia that looked at the challenges of flood risk transfer, which I think is proposes a roadmap to tackle identify difficulties, but I also think it's a little bit forward-looking report that provides for the opportunity to plan and budget better. Perhaps 2 examples that UNDP is working, not in North Macedonia, but we will be happy to discuss and see whether this is something that would be of interest for the government here. First one is the UNDP has started a new global program on SDG and taxes with I think, Taxes Without Borders, with the organization called Taxes Without Borders. And we have now an experience from Spain where taxes are reduced for the private sector companies that prove that their investments are SDG oriented or aligned with SDGs. This is one of the things that I think can make sense, and it is very much linked also to the climate agenda. Climate is SDG 13 is one of the SDGs as well. And the second one is, of course, public finance tagging that UNDP has been doing for quite some time. It has started with the climate finance tagging, now it is SDG finance tagging. And this is something that we have been doing pretty much globally, but also in this region, in the Western Balkans as well. So in conclusion, perhaps the ambition of the SDGs requires increased financing for SDG impact. It should be also noted that innovation is an integral part of new way of looking at things and being relevant to the new reality. Because we all call the post-COVID or COVID times new normal. We don't know what is normal any longer as far as I am concerned and how it will evolve. So I think relevance is one of the key criteria for us to remain relevant throughout the process and adapt to the situation. Of course, it is not enough to just innovate, but I think as you quoted rightly the President of Mexico, we should double our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, this is a road less taken, the disaster risk management. It has not received sufficient policy attention and of course the need to have an overarching national development strategy that will prioritize the policies and then ensure that they are financially mirrored in the budget is more than necessary. And as you mentioned, business as usual is no longer the preferred development pathway because the cost of inaction is going high. I would like to ask Minister Nureddini how to motivate the private sector to be more agile, not to understand the adjustment as incurring environmental costs, but as investment opportunities, investment in environment-friendly businesses and profitable opportunities also, not only as alignment with the standards and additional cost to their businesses.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to actually mention that we did not upset my colleague, Minister Bessimi. He's actually in a budget commission today in Parliament. So he's not upset by us panelists, I hope.
I apologize. I should have said that he was asked by the members of the Parliament to come in for the session.
So he's defending the increase of my budget, hopefully, but we'll see about that. How do we motivate and stimulate the private sector? I think one of the things that we need to do, especially from the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Economy, and a few other institutions, need to start being more explain it better. A lot of people actually get a bit concerned when we speak about green economy, energy efficiency, etc. The first thing that people think about is implied costs. That's the first reaction that we get from the private sector, because they see it as a cost factor. They say, oh no, I actually need to invest in energy efficiency, I need to invest in renewable energy. However, though, we need to explain it, we need to be more open about it, maybe start with more campaigns and have more meetings with the private sector and explain to them that this is a short-term cost. In the medium to long run, it's actually cost-saving for them. And a lot of these projects, especially for the industry, these are cost-saving measures. And especially when the government is subsidizing up to 20% of solar panels for the industry and rooftops, that is actually a further cost-saving factor. You mentioned earlier the priorities of the ministry, and I'll be honest with you, I thought we had priorities when I first became a minister, but then I realized there's not priorities, there's actually a lot of different topics to cover. So maybe that's one of the things that we need to realign as government and as ministries, not as government, as institutions, and the intersectoral collaboration to actually be talking about the same topic at the same time. Because again, energy is a cost-saving, renewable energy and energy efficiency is a cost-saving factor for them. Furthermore, and I think we have some representatives here from the food and beverage industry. With the change in the laws that we're proposing now in waste management, we're actually including the extended producer responsibility scheme to be more strict in there. And within that, we will be stimulating that, we're helping the extended producer responsibility scheme to actually have more money and more financial aid, so to speak, to be able to place the containers on the road, for us citizens to be able to select our waste, for that to be collected, and hopefully to create an industry, a recycling industry, thereby talking about the circular economy. Now, if you compare, and I will be very honest with you, if you compare the weight of an average bottle of water, empty of course, not full, and of an average bottle of water in the EU, where the costs of actually placing packaging on the market is a lot higher compared to our standards, it actually deviates considerably, because these, as I said, reforms will be creating the necessity for the private industry to reform, create lighter packaging, less packaging. But we need to be the first ones. We need to be taking these bold, courageous decisions as government and apply these reforms. Some of them might not be very appreciated at the beginning, but trust me, in the next couple of years, they will show huge results. So it has to come from the government in collaboration with the private sector, and we need to be explaining it better to them, because this will lead to cost cutting for them in the long run as well.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a question regarding the possible introduction of a environmental or carbon tax. Is the government thinking about introducing a carbon tax, or is it, let's say, policy option that is also supported by international development partners? So any of you could address this question?
Sure, with pleasure. I mean, we are of the belief that the polluter needs to pay principle. It's been applied all across the world. It's been applied across the developed countries and developing countries. We desire to have a clean and healthy environment for our citizens. I'm sure the private sector desires to have healthy employees, which will be more effective and efficient and productive tomorrow. The question we need to be, as I said earlier, as I had a short intervention, was we have finalized the law on climate action, and we were looking at actually applying a carbon tax in there. We have to balance it. We have to speak very well, to be very open about it. We need to consult the Ministry of Finance, consult the Ministry of Economy, because the countries surrounding us have not applied it. And if we apply a carbon taxing on our products, in our laws, that might indirectly put our companies at a disadvantage. Because, as I said earlier, the key energy they're actually currently being supplied with is from Rekbutala, or for Rekoslime, which is coal. It's coal. So indirectly, we're going to be forcing them to pay for their products and increase their costs, which will bring them to disadvantage to the neighboring countries which don't have the carbon taxing yet.
Yeah.
We would like to start to it. Of course we don't, because I think currently in the European market the emissions tax rate is about 46 euros on the carbon taxing. If we apply that to our market right now with these energy costs, I fear that the majority of our private sector will be disadvantaged compared to the surrounding competition. However, though, we're looking at putting it in there with a scaling factor. We might start with symbolic value, then increase it over the next few years. Because at the end of the day, the EU or the EU members, they will charge us a fee for the products we produce using fossil fuels. So all the exports, and the minister mentioned earlier, 70%, he wants to increase exports by 70%. Mm-hmm. However, though, if we're using conventional energy like fossil fuels, eventually we'll get charged a fee to export our products into the EU, which is one of our largest partners, trading partners. So we're going to have to move away. So hence why it's a must for us to diversify our energy production and move towards a new direction. Because otherwise our economy will directly be negatively impacted by one of our largest trading partners.
Right. And probably if it is introduced, it might be good to think about regional cooperation, so not to lose competitiveness. Maybe if all countries in the region introduce a small percentage so that there will be no loss in terms of competitiveness. But obviously it's a very urgent issue, priority environmental issue. It's tackled in the long-term energy strategy. It will be addressed in the national development strategy. Maybe Massimiliano, something about the other environmental priorities, or how to ensure strengthened financing, let's say. Should the government reprioritize its limited public resources, or it should strive for more private sector engagement, mobilization of private capital?
Thank you, Professor. I think that when we have this discussion, we often have this, let's say, how can I put it? We think if there are no enough public resources, then the private sector will come in. Well, yes and no. There may be enough public resources, but as I noted before, it's an issue perhaps of prioritizing the public resources differently. There may be some allocation in the budget that are for non-productive purposes or subsidies that may be looked at in order to create the fiscal space that would allow for the public sector to provide the resources that will leverage private sector resources. But the private sector will not invest if they do not believe that the conditions for investments are there, and that speaks for certainty, predictability, in several areas, including the tax system, the justice system. So, as you can see, it's not a simple equation, either or. The two things will go hand in hand together, and our understanding is that the leverage factor is going to be higher the more predictability of the public sector, the more the private sector is predictable in those areas. So I think it's a long haul, and we see a lot of efforts being made by the administration here in North Macedonia to actually address those issues, and what Minister Noureddini was also saying about all the interventions on excise and the carbon law, etc. So it goes in the same direction, but it's part of a big package, and it doesn't happen overnight, right? It doesn't happen overnight, so we should also be realistic about the timing of reforms, the complexity of reforms, and how this process is never a straightforward process. But you need to start from somewhere, acknowledging the limitations, and also having very clear in your mind where what your end result would be.
Well, I could not make a better summary for the panel. If some of you would like to add something, yes, Mr. Grigorian, before I summarize.
Yes, thank you very much. Perhaps linking a few thoughts that I have to what the Minister and the representative from World Bank have already mentioned. Approximately 300,000 lives or deaths are attributed to air pollution every year in Europe only. So when we are talking about emissions, this is also about the air quality. One of the issues that we have tried to do at the regional level is to conduct a regional assessment of linkages between air pollution and climate change. And this is something that doesn't come out very straightforward, but there is a link. And in the context of North Macedonia, it also has a very strong link with energy. And I mentioned the energy crisis before. I would like to confirm that UNDP is in negotiations both with the government and with our headquarters to seek for emergency funding to address some of the needs that are coming up related to the energy crisis for the most vulnerable people who will be or are already affected by the energy crisis.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, financing the SDG requires a lot of prioritization, augmenting the public resources with higher, let's say, fiscal burden possibly, but that will be justified on the grounds of better targeted spending. The public resources should also try to mobilize private capital to involve the businesses in the attainment of these sustainable development goals through blended financing. And business as usual is no longer the preferred development pathway, because the cost of inaction, as Minister Nureddini mentioned, exceeds the cost of planned interventions and incentives, greater incentives for the investment in environment-friendly sectors. I would like to thank you for your time to think and discuss more strategic issues. It has been a great pleasure and honor, and I would like to invite all participants present here in person for a coffee break. Deserved coffee break. Thank you.
Thank you.
Во овој панел би сакал да ја продискутираме сегашната и идната потенцијална улога на финансиските пазари и на приватниот сектор во контекст на одржливиот развој и сето тоа да
of sustainable development. No, this should be put in the context how domestic banks will position themselves, insurance companies, pension and investment funds, which will remain the key catalyst for increased good governance for sustainable development on the part of the private sector. The panelists today are the key stakeholders that are working on accelerated realization of the Agenda 2030. The governor of the central bank, Anita Bezhovska, Gligor Bishev, General Director of Sparkasa Bank Macedonia, Ms. Linia Nadush, formal member of Eastern Europe, Intergovernmental Group of Experts for International Standards for Accounting and Reporting. And online, we will hear from Mr. Daniel Buzas-Luis, Regional Coordinator for Europe, UNEP Finance Initiative. Welcome all to this panel. Before we start the debate, in addition to the audience here, we also have audience that is following the panel online. Those who are following us online can ask questions, write their questions in the chat, and all those questions will be answered in the second part of the debate, while the audience present here will have a chance to ask questions once we hear the presentations of the panelists. In the very beginning, I said the topic we're discussing today is very interesting, and it is really part of our public discourse. And therefore, many initiatives which are being taken and exist in our country are not sufficiently known for the general public. Therefore, we will today discuss about concrete examples for approaches, tools, instruments for such financing, but as well as initiatives that enable harmonization with the SDGs, and at the same time give a motivation, an example to extend the portfolios for sustainable financing. Let's start with the Governor Angelovska-Bezhovska. Ms. Governor, there is now increasingly more literature and debate that central banks and financial regulators should also address climate risks and support sustainable finance. An indicator for this is the establishment and the fast growth of the network of central banks and financial supervisors for Green Finance System, NGNS, and the Network for Sustainable Banking. The first network was established in 2017. It includes many members, including the Central Bank of North Macedonia. Members have already reached consensus that climate change are a source of financial risk, and central banks should address such a risk. In both networks that I mentioned, there is an active discussion about the role of the central banks in terms of increasing and shifting to sustainable finance in order to achieve the SDGs, as well as which is their role as a regulator to stimulate financial institutions to incorporate standard for good ecological and sustainable governance, especially with regard to investments and borrowing, which is the position of our central bank in this regard. First of all, allow me to thank Ms. Ducek, the organizer of this event. It is my great pleasure to be part of such an event where we discuss an exceptionally important global topic. Of course, as you already mentioned, my discussion will be from the aspect of the central banks taking activities in order to achieve the 17 SDGs of the United Nations is an imperative for all economic policy creators, both from moral aspect, having in mind the content of the SDGs, and also the economic aspect. There are estimates that show the damage of climate change over the global GDP. According to these estimates, this accounts to 25%. According to the estimates of the IMF, climate change reduces the global growth in average for 0.4 percentage points, and this effect is even more pronounced in less developed economies and reaches 0.7 percentage points. And maybe more importantly, according to the estimates, in the next period, this economic damage or harm that is caused by climate change would be even bigger. This was just an introduction. Why all policy creators, including the central banks, need to approach this issue in a different way. Seen from the aspect of the central bank, one can ask two questions. The first key question is whether climate change influence the goals of the central banks, and the second question is how should central banks approach this issue, that is, which is the role that they should take or they can take in this process. The answer to the first question is affirmative. No dilemma. Globally, climate change influence the goals of the central bank, both the price stability and the financial stability. Climate change also influence the price stability through weather conditions, reduced offer, destabilization of prices. In addition to this, one cannot forget that policies for green transition also have impact on the price stability. In front of us, we have a classical example, and that is the global energetic shock, which, among other factors, of course, this is a complex phenomenon, but this also is the result of the policies of green transition. Seen from the perspective of economists, it's a fact that these are shocks on the side of the offer, and in general, central banks should not react because these are temporary. But one cannot forget that climate change cause these shocks to be more pronounced, more excessive, which makes the prices volatile. And this has negative impact on the expectations for inflation. Let us remind ourselves, shocks on the side of the offer, global liquidity, demand, and the third most important factor is the inflation expectations, and all this impact the inflation. In addition to the global consensus that climate change impact the prices, in the community of central bank, there are many dilemmas about this issue. I would mention several dilemmas. If central banks, through their own instruments, help certain industries, for example, for renewable sources of energy, does this disrupt the market neutrality, which should be in the foundation of monetary policies? Other dilemmas, whether central banks really have efficient and effective instruments, because the purpose is not to act, but taking such action should be effective. or whether central banks have any legal mandate for such competencies, and even if they have legal powers to do this, which is noticed as a trend in some economies, does this mean that they can be overburdened with too many objectives, because these objectives would increase all the time after the global economic crisis, and this can lead actually put in risk the basic goals. Even though there are dilemmas, there is a clear trend that, especially in the past 5 years, central banks are paying much more attention to climate change. One example, you already mentioned the network on green finance. For illustration, when this network was being established in 2017, there were only 8 central banks in this network. Nowadays, there are 19 central banks which are members of these networks. This speaks about the focus that on this issue. Another survey conducted this year to check the perception of central banks clearly shows that around 64% of the central banks nowadays see the climate change as change which is constituent part of their mandate. Unlike this, the same survey 5 years ago showed the same answer, but only in 45% of the answers. Some central banks are already taking specific steps. I would mention the European Central Bank, which in its new monetary strategy, published in July this year, clearly indicates that when monetary policy is implemented and the selection of instruments, the central bank will take into account which of these instruments impacts the climate change. There are other more extreme examples. Recently, the Central Bank of Hungary was given a mandate by law about climate change. What are we doing as central bank? Of course, that we are monitoring the global change. We are member of the network of green finance. In addition, this year, we have included climate change as one of the strategic goals of the central bank in our strategic plan on middle term, and we also carried out a survey that if any activities are taken, the first essential step is to do screening to see what is the current situation. Allow me briefly to mention some of the conclusions that come out of this survey about the banking system. What does the survey show? Around 70% of the banks in the country approve loans with positive impact on the environment. Around 43% of the banks already have established formal systems of identification of green sustainable projects. The total amount of green loans is relatively small, 150 million euros, or just 2.5% of the total number of loans. But the positive thing about this is that this amount is growing. There is an increasing trend. Last year, we had a growth of 23%, and this year, this growth continues, but with a lower rate. Another important aspect is that these loans are dominantly financed from available deposits in the banking system, and around 1/4 are loans from international financial institutions. To sum up, this survey shows that the share of green credits in our banking system is quite small, but the positive thing is that it is growing, and there is an increased focus by the banks on this segment, which is also very positive, especially having in mind that the banking potential is quite big. The assets of the banking system is around 90% in the GDP, and continuously it generates growth. And at the end, I would say that in order to shift the banking potential towards sustainable goals, it's clear that this is a complex problem. We definitely need a holistic approach applied by many stakeholders in the society, including the central banks, but also the international financial institutions, which can have important role of catalyst in this segment. In the following period, as a central bank, We will continue contributing to this very important area, and I would mention some of the activities that we are planning in the following period. Introduction of regular statistical system for reporting on green finance. Starting from next year, we will conduct a survey to make a detailed analysis of risks for the banks. Based on the survey and the analysis, we will also prepare guidelines for the operation of banks with regard to green finance, including the aspect of transparency, but also we will be preparing ourselves for stress tests in order to assess the resilience of the banking system, which will require strengthening the institutional capacities, both of the regulator but also the business banks. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Governor. You raised a number of interesting issues in areas where the National Bank, the central bank, is already moving, and I think that we will revisit these issues during the discussion. Mr. Bischoff, you're heading a bank which is demonstrating significant efforts to integrate environmental, social, and governance aspects in your business model. What does this mean specifically? Can you show us some examples of how you do that? And do these policies include creating so-called sustainability profiles of your clients in order to incentivize more private actors to develop such profiles so that they can access more funding, more finance? And the second question would be perhaps more in your role as a professor and someone who is very familiar with the situation in this segment about the risks posed by climate change. Sustainable development based on the UN Green Agenda is in the focus of almost all banks worldwide, and especially banks in the United States and European Union, where a number of countries have enacted their respective agendas to reduce CO2 emissions to zero by 2050. And having in mind that 85% of the banking sector in the Republic of North Macedonia is owned by banking groups from countries outside North Macedonia, predominantly European Union, in fact, this means that most of the banks in North Macedonia are following these trends and incorporate project sustainability standards in their operations, as well as favoring non-polluting industries. For example, in the European Union, a directive was enacted stipulating that from 2021, coal mines would no longer be financed, and neither would be power generation from coal. So a number of banks, including Sparkasse in Macedonia, also takes the position that we would not support electric power generation from coal. And we incorporated all environmental preservation standards, responsible policies, and suitable governance systems. And from that aspect, the Republic of North Macedonia will increasingly base its growth on this type of products, which are complex and target not only energy efficiency, but also digitalization organic food production, innovative projects, and the banking industry is increasingly recognizing this. And according to our estimate from the new loans growth, the governor stated the overall loans, including those who have already been approved, but for new loans, we estimate that about 25% are targeted at projects that are in these segments. For example, only in electricity production from renewable sources over the last 3 years, 72 million euros have been approved for these projects, and Sparkasse alone has approved 33 million euros, mainly in the area of small hydropower plants, photovoltaic plants, and biogas. Sparkasse has approved 62 projects with a total capacity of 51 megawatts. This does not include the most recent investment syndicated, so incorporating a number of banks, including Sparkasse, Komercijalna, and Nova Ljubljanska banka, together with Erste Bank, which led the project and the syndicate. And this loan is for wind generation, electricity generation from wind, total amount of 61 million euros. So for projects of this type, we need not only funds or assets, but also know-how to properly assess return on investment and other parameters. And that will be the second decisive factor, namely knowledge of the companies, including consulting companies, to assess such projects. Another project that I would mention, where Sparkasse was agent bank, and it was funded by the parent group, Erste Bank, together with Deutsche Bank, was the gas pipeline, which is being finished this year, including the sections Negotino-Kavadarci to Bitola and Skopje-Tetovo-Gostivar. Of course, credit lines from the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Green Growth Fund, and the Green Economy Fund are very helpful in these projects. 4 banks take part in these programs, and Sparkasse Bank has approved 37 million euros from these funds, and they are mainly aimed at companies and individuals for energy efficiency, including more efficient energy generation. This also incentivizes introduction of new technologies and economic growth in the Republic of North Macedonia. Something that was not mentioned, but something that is supported by the banking industry are innovative projects, startup projects designed by young entrepreneurs and are targeting innovative segments. And Sparkasse Banka started this program in 2018. We have gone through 2 cycles, and the 3rd cycle is now underway. 80 young entrepreneurs with innovative ideas have received credit support, loan support. Now this is also done by the Innovation Fund, and starting this year we will be doing it for the first time with the Chamber of Commerce of the Republic of Macedonia. Together with the companies and the banking industry, and the startup businesses will get a chance for the first time. But it is interesting and important to note that what is being provided is not just funding but also mentoring, and I hope that this will also help spread and improve awareness about new technologies, not just environmental protection. So this is where I would end, and if there are any questions later, we can discuss them.
Thank you very much for your presentation. One can notice your portfolio, as you mentioned, which includes all kinds of segments related to sustainable finance, and I do hope that this will serve as encouragement not only for the banking industry, but in general for the banking sector, as this is expected in future. Now, welcome to Mr. Buzas Luis. I hope we can hear Mr. Buzas Luis. He's joining us online from Geneva. As I mentioned at the very beginning, he's the regional coordinator for Europe for the Financial Initiative for the Environmental Program of the United Nations. Mr. Buzas, I hope that you can hear us, that you can follow the interpretation. At the very beginning, can you please tell us about this financial initiative? Can you please tell us which is its role in overcoming the imperfect market information for ensuring sustainable finance? And another thing we want to hear from you is about the diversity of what has been achieved in Europe by all the players on the financial market, especially by the banks. Because here in the Macedonian financial system, they are the major players. How can banks be more efficient in teaching their clients how to approach risks, effects, and opportunities? But how can the central bank as regulator approach the banks in this regard? What is responsible banking, and which are the principles that are guiding this responsible banking?
Thank you. Thank you very much as well for the invitation, for the questions. I'm very happy to be here. First of all, I think there's a lot of questions, a lot of ground to cover. I will try to make it as efficient as possible. And I would also like to try and reference some of the points that have already been made by the speakers before me. So first of all, who we are at UNEP-FI and what we do. So UNEP-FI is the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. So we are let's say, a collaboration between the United Nations and the global financial sector. We are, let's say, a part of UNEP, and we have direct membership of around more than 400 member institutions that are direct members to UNEP-FI, being banks, insurers, and investors, and more than 100 supporting institutions that work with us for many, many years to already helping integrate sustainability considerations into financial practice and to mobilize private finance for sustainable development. What this means in practice is like we leverage principles and alliances in order to get the industry to work in the way forward and to integrate sustainability into their operations. And that we do it, let's say, we have a dual approach. We're looking to what is called the double materiality approach. So the outside-in risks, so how climate is impacting the portfolio of the financial institutions, and the inside-out approach, that is how financial institutions, thanks to their financing, can leverage and improve, let's say, and generate more positive impacts than negative impacts in their financing. This may be looked also as well in a way in which you can see how banks may be interested in better managing the risks, and that is something that is also happening thanks to the role of the central banks. And in the presentation before, also the Governor Angelovska-Berchowska was also talking about this, about how can the central banks have a role and approach this in a more concrete way. So going back to UNEP-FI, how we look and work with the financial institutions, again, is through principles and alliances. And we do that by working with banks. For example, we have the principle for responsible banking. There are 6 principles that, when banks integrate them, allow them to have a better alignment, better impact and target setting, better engagement with clients and customers, stakeholders, and to, in the end, provide better transparency and accountability on how their finance is actually going towards, let's say, financing the SDGs, how that finance is going towards supporting environmental, social, and governance goals. So they are principles that allow financial institutions to better understand how this is happening. And when we go more in depth, banks can set targets in many different ways, and they need to be impact targets. So these targets can be on topics such as climate. And for that, we have the Net Zero Banking Alliance that is allowing banks that join this alliance to work together towards having net zero portfolios by 2050. For that, they need to set targets to understand how the portfolio is actually performing in terms of sustainability impacts, and then change it in order to make sure that they reach these climate goals. Of course, they can also set targets in other areas, like social areas, and we are just publishing today, actually, a commitment for banks to work on financial inclusion and financial health. We also work with insurers and investors. I mean, investors right now are, let's say, head of the pack. I mean, we have the Principle for Responsible Investment. That is a sister organization that is working on that front. But internally at UNEP-FI, we also have the Principle for Sustainable Insurance that is working with insurers to, similarly as the PRB, to embed in the decision-making environmental, social, and governance issues relevant to the insurance business, and to work with the business partners, the clients, and the customers in order to make sure that everything is working towards these goals. But of course, sustainable finance can be a bit esoteric to define if you are looking at both from the risk and the impact perspective. So for that, one of the key elements that I believe defines sustainability and sustainable finance is that of an example of imperfect information in the market, where both from the climate risk side, you cannot predict very well what is going to happen. Acute weather events or flash floods or increased, let's say, heat waves. You do not know when are they going to come, so you need to be resilient and prepared enough in order to withstand them and, as much as possible, predict them. With the sustainability impacts in terms of how the financing that you provide is going to impact the economy and going to impact the companies that you're financing, there are further possibilities to assess. But still, it is not clear unless you have information from the company, where should the company that you're financing go? If you have a large exposure to an energy generation company and the split of their, let's say, proceeds is not clearly identified, it is very complex to work with them and collaborate in order to move forward. So information and data, it's critical in order to assess this way forward. And it's great to see banks like Sparkasse looking already into improving projects on the segments that are sustainable, as well as working with different banks and with like consortiums in order to grow ahead. And also the approach of the central bank in order to also have more regular statistical reporting on green finance. All of this is underpinning the critical aspects that we have seen emerging in Europe, and especially the EU regulation on sustainable finance is critical into actually exploring and unearthing the critical consequences of not having, let's say, that perfect information in the market. And we have seen it through investors, banks, and insurers to be covered by regulatory requirements as well as the companies in order to provide information of how well they're performing against the EU sustainability goals. So let's say that definition of what is the threshold that you should be performing against in order to be reaching the EU goals, and how the banks are financing or providing finance that actually matches those goals is critical in order to see an increase on sustainability. And it's not only about new green products, but it's also about understanding what is the sustainability impact of non-green projects on non-green companies. So you have a full impact approach on how well that project is being financed and what is the sustainability that is underpinning it. So on the other front, banks are as well risk managers and credit intermediators in the economy, that they need to very well understand what is not only the financial viability, but also the environmental, social, and governance viability of the finance that they provide. And they work directly with customers to address their needs through different approaches, but also they need to understand how they need to see, let's say, the regulation in the way forward. Because if prudential regulators in the future are coming with stringent, let's say, more stringent approaches to sustainability risks, they need to be well tuned in order to integrate them as well into their systems. And that is where, the combined approach between impact and risk needs to be understood. And maybe this is a bit going a bit far away, but when we see banks that are joining our principles and they're joining our approaches in order to improve and go forward to better finance sustainable projects, at the same time, that enables them to better understand their portfolio, to shape their business model in the way forward, and also have a better discussion on what do they have in terms of exposures, not only to climate risks, but to climate positive projects and companies in their portfolio with the financial regulators. And they can speak with the central bank or with the regulator and say, look, I am already actively managing my portfolio in order to be more sustainable. Thus, my exposures to climate risks is lower because I am going in the way forward. And they say that connection between risks and the portfolio alignment and the risks is one that needs to be clearly identified and be more circular in order to achieve greater impacts on sustainability. And it is great to see already the Network for Green the Financial System, many banks joining in UNEPFI in order to work towards that goal. And I would like to conclude by saying that I think that it is great, the work that I've been seeing now in North Macedonia, for example, where there's coming also a very interesting report on SDG financing, where, of course, you're mentioning as well the UNEPFI principles, and to say that the closeness to the EU and the closeness, as also Gligor was referencing from Spark Asset, many of the banks that are operating in your national jurisdiction are coming from the EU, and they are coming, let's say, with that background and that bias, if we can call it somehow, of the sustainability approach that is coming at the European Union level. And I think that is quite positive in order to learn and understand how things are working, how things are happening, in order to make a change and to make sure that finance and growth and, let's say, the economic sustainability of the country can also perform at that level. And I think that is also very, very encouraging. So, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for taking time today to join us online in this discussion. And no doubt all of these issues that you discussed and which we see as being a step ahead or a few steps ahead from what we are discussing in the country. And hopefully it will stimulate us to talk about principles of responsible banking as well as responsible acting in the insurance industry, in investments, etc. And all of this should make the key stakeholders think in the same direction and share the same vocabulary. And all of this will help achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I will finish the panel with the fourth speaker, Lydia Nanos. So we touched on a number of aspects of sustainable finance, but perhaps it's worth asking, is there a common denominator with regard to a common definition of what kind of activities would be considered proper environmental, sustainable corporate governance? Unfortunately, these matters frequently take a backseat, and also financial markets and investors do not always have an easy time recognizing what is worth funding, and it is sometimes difficult for them to select companies that could be part of a sustainable investment portfolio. Now, you're coming from the segment of financial reporting. You have been working in audit for a long time, so I would like to ask you to give us an overview of the latest developments in corporate reporting, accounting related to environmentally responsible and sustainable operations, and this is quite topical internationally, and this is also part of the concerns of the Intergovernmental Working Group on International Standards of Accounting and Reporting. Right, thank you. First of all, I would like to welcome this initiative coming from the United Nations, because it brings these topics closer to the public and in some ways demystifies these topics, because sustainability entails efforts for a better environment, clean water, protection of flora and fauna, and within the Intergovernmental Working Group on International Standards of Financial Reporting and Accounting, constituted by the United Nations Economic Social Council, has a mission to help member states apply best practices in achieving economic development and adequate allocation of resources. Since 2015, within this expert group, the focus has been on the Sustainable Development Goals and how to contribute towards establishing an ecosystem of regulations that is going to be a common denominator for valuations throughout the world. Three elements are important here. The materiality of these projects, relevance, and comparability among the projects. So what is the focus of this working group? In recent years, the working group has been attempting to identify indicators classified into four segments or four parts, namely economic, environmental, social, and institutional, so that those indicators would be a measure of value within companies, within public utilities or institutions in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The manner in which this information is communicated is by establishing a link between macro and micro indicators, as well as how those indicators are measured. I would like to first give an overview of the progress on the regulatory efforts in the European Union. In many places in the world, like for example in the United States, it is quite advanced, but the European Non-Financial Reporting Directive from 2014 established the foundations for business and for how these indicators are communicated with the public. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will be applicable starting in fiscal 2023 and will include requirements for disclosure of information that are material and relevant for sustainability of companies, and not just listed companies, but also medium and small businesses. So what are the differences between what we have today as communication to the public or interested parties, which is part of the present financial reports, and what will be required under the SDG compliant reporting? Traditional reporting leaves out non-material assets which are not even measured oftentimes and cannot be covered by traditional reporting standards, such as Standard 38. So there are assets and flows that cannot be measured. Traditional reports measure historic events, and these past events or historic events are the main components of the balance sheet, profit and loss statement, as well as capital changes report. So they need to also incorporate indicators of capital adequacy, reserves or reservations, and depreciation, etc. And these new indicators will contribute towards the measurement of effects and impacts of the application of these standards.
For example, Macedonia has given priority for five objectives: poverty reduction, education, economic growth, climate action, and strengthening the institutions. For example, Goal 13, which refers to the climate action. If the measure to prevent natural catastrophes is some targeted task, the indicator through which we will measure this target is, let's say, the number of casualties from catastrophes at 100,000 citizens. There were how many municipalities took preventive activities for such catastrophes? Then integrating the measures in the national policies. That is another targeted task as part of the climate change. The indicator here will be the total emission of gas. Then education of public and raising awareness about climate change. Indicator here would be how many educational situations there are institutions that are subjects for raising the awareness, or if we look at goal number 8, it is also one of the priorities and it is closely related to poverty reduction. The target to achieve growth of 7% economic growth, increase of GDP per capita is also one of the indicators which can be calculated. This can be also derived from the company's financial reports, or also increase in productivity through innovation, technological development. Indicator for this would be the annual growth of gross rates per employee. These are all measurable indicators which address all these achievements by the private sector, the public sector, or the institutions. Thank you. If I understood well, this directive is something relatively new, and we should start thinking about transposing that directive in our legislation. According to this directive, sustainable reporting will have to be prepared by each company, or this will be done on voluntary basis, or any more progressive companies will be doing such sustainability reporting. No, it's not going to be on voluntary basis, because the European directive will impose an obligation, not only reporting on SDGs, especially the financial institutions and other companies, but also small and medium enterprises will have to do this. So this will be part of the reporting obligation to see to which extent companies are committed, and this will help the banks as well, but it will also help the statistical system to measure to which extent the society is committed to realization of these projects. This would be great encouragement. One more thing, this directive will require major changes about the audit directive, the accounting directive, so significant changes are also expected. This will be a report just like a balance sheet. This will be an annual report of the company. In this annual report, there will be also a report on sustainability, that is to which extent the company and how the company is committed to the SDGs and how is this communicated to the general public. As I said, this is relatively new, but it's good to be informed, and it's good to inform as many stakeholders about this as possible, because this will require support from the whole society. And of course, this will lead to more efficient response by the companies. Thank you all for the first part of the panel. We have 10 more minutes. I don't want to have my own discussion with the panelists. Rather, I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience here. And also those who are online can ask questions, write them in the chat. Since there are no online questions, anyone from the audience, do you have any questions? Thank you. My name is Pavlina Zdraveva. I work in UNDP on climate change projects and also this creation of climate change national policies. It's my pleasure that for the first time I hear that the banking sector is giving detailed information about climate change. And I think that we need to cooperate more, especially technical staff with the finance staff, in order to ensure maximum impact. I have several questions. The first question is related to finance and the figures that the governor and Mr. Peshev mentioned today. Our state is a signatory of the Climate Change Convention. Therefore, it should report on climate finance. That is, funds received from abroad in the country to support climate change, but also funds that we allocate for this purpose. The figures that you mentioned today, that is, which percentage of the banks invest in climate change? Do you have such data? Do you collect this data on an annual basis? Or the survey that you mentioned, can this survey provide such data? Can somehow this data be published on an annual basis? Another thing, we just finished the global annual conference about the climate change, and one thing that everyone was focused on is where banks invest the money that they use for their operations. Which percentage of these funds is invested in renewable sources of energies or green projects that reduce the green gas emissions, or projects that contribute to the adaptation, and which is the part that supports the fossil fuel-based economy? Mr. Bishop, you mentioned that your bank drew a conclusion that you will no longer finance such projects, but not all projects are related only to coal. There are many other things related here. So I would like to hear, how will you proceed working on this topic? And can somehow your experience be transferred to the other banks? If there are other questions, can we please hear the questions, and then the panelists will provide you the answers. Any other questions? Fine. If there are no questions, then we can proceed with the answers. And we can discuss the aspects discussed by Ms. Zdraveva. Thank you for the questions. These are definitely relevant questions. In my presentation, I already mentioned that we, as central bank, as of recently, by following the global trends, we increasingly focus on these issues. The survey that I mentioned is actually the first survey of this type conducted. We collected the data as part of a regular survey that we have been doing. That is an annual survey. However, we have included something new in this survey, which refers to green finance. Because you're asking whether we will be producing or generating data on a regular basis. One of the key aspects in order to take any activities is having appropriate statistical data in combination with various surveys and research. Yes, we will continue doing this survey. I mentioned that we will be conducting a new survey next year. The focus of that survey will be a bit different, not only in terms of to which extent the banks finance green projects, whether this is for the corporate sector or for which activities, but rather the survey will be more focused on the exposure risks to ecologically or environmentally not sustainable projects. We afterwards plan appropriate measures and activities that will support green finance and increase the awareness in banks for better risk assessment to which they are exposed, and they need to implement those risks in their own framework. Mr. Bischoff mentioned that banks in our country, especially banks which are branch offices of European banks, and the European Union is already has a leading position. They already have taken into account all of these aspects. However, we all need to take a coherent approach so that we can have a playing field for all the banks in the country. And this will provide for further support of this process of increasing the awareness, but also channelizing the banking potential towards green projects. One should not forget that this is not a question that refers only to the banks. Our economy, like many other economies in the neighboring countries, we have less available revenues and our capital markets are practically not developed. And this is also another major potential. So if we focus on this potential can also help the green finance. And finally, I would point out that if we see the available potential of our economy, the overall saving in the economy is quite low, not only here, but also in other similar economies. Such economies require huge support from the international financial institutions that can play a role of catalyst. We have done a screening with the survey that I previously mentioned to see to which extent the green loans, which are now in the portfolio of the banks, whether those are financed by international institutions. I said 1/4 of these loans are supported by international financial institutions. Therefore, I think that international institutions can also encourage investment in such projects.
Thank you, Anita. Of course, one can have a favorable view of this if 1/4 of the deposit base is allocated for this. This means that even without pressure, so to speak, there is awareness among the banks to devote these resources to such funding. Professor, would you like to address this? Well, in principle, the restructuring of the economy is something that should be done by all of us, because ultimately the projects come from companies, and they also come from the retail level, from private individuals. So there should be more awareness that the application of these standards for sustainable development and green energy is not only for the purpose of preserving a healthy environment, human health, etc., but also for the purpose of achieving savings among companies and even in household budgets. So this is a long-term process, and it would be good if everyone would contribute to it, and developing a national strategy that will have some timeframes and deadlines might have an impact. For example, 60% of the electric power in the Republic of Macedonia is generated from coal. And if there is no strategy on how that electric power generation would be substituted or replaced, then regardless of activities in other segments, the pollution and electricity generation from inappropriate fuels will persist, and the transition will not take place in an acceptable time frame. The Macedonian Banking Association shares industry experiences, and also we collect some data, so unification is proceeding apace, and the contribution of the central bank would also be important, because that is the institution that would be in a good position to aggregate this data and make it available. And even though the European Union and the USA are advancing quickly, still they are not so advanced in terms of the overall environment. So there is some statistic information that about 40% of the total loan growth are sustainable growth loans, including green energy, digitalization, and what they call environmental responsibility, corporate social responsibility, and good corporate governance. In the US, it is 50% of the growth in new lending. Having in mind that the lending growth or credit growth in Macedonia is 200 million, so 30 to 40% growth in this area would put us at around 25%. So a lot can be achieved even with modest amounts. And as I said before, it's not just down to the funds, but also proposing good projects and having the knowledge to assess them. Thank you. Okay, we still have Daniel on the line, and if he would like to join the discussion on the matters and issues that we're discussing, you should feel free to do so. Daniel?
I think from, let's say, the European perspective, what we can see is, let's say, that there's a very specific European approach that is looking, let's say, and I haven't heard it much today, there is the EU taxonomy. And I think when we look into approaches such as that, is where you can see, let's say, the benefits of, let's say, the collaboration between the private and the public sector. That is a topic that has been actually raised, and the possibility to have disclosures that are relevant in terms of understanding how the economy should move in the way forward. And I think that participating in this kind of processes and trying to define or look into how the EU taxonomy would be relevant for a context like yours, it would be very relevant to understand, okay, how can this be transposed? How can this be assessed or analyzed? Or what are the specific sectors that are going to be impacted if, let's say, these banks that are operating in the country are going to be looking into this criteria and how this could be, let's say, complied with. And that's one of the elements that it's quite, let's say, focused from the European side, and it's coming quite strongly as well on the disclosure front. And it's complementary to all of the approaches that we have seen to, let's say, the approach from the central banks, from the banks, and let's say from the companies that we need to disclose the information. So it's a way of looking at sustainability that, if done since the beginning in a concerted way, can bring a lot of benefits, I believe.
Благодарам, Даниел. Бидејќи привршуваме да...
Thank you, Daniel. And since we're close to the end, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for your participation in this panel and hope to see you soon. And before finishing, we have another question, Nikita Kusinikova.
Good day to everyone. I'll try to be as short as possible. My name is Nikita Kusinikova from the Association Connect, and we're Secretariat of the Network of the Global Agreement of the United Nations here in North Macedonia. As part of our activities, we are working on merging the private sector with the institutions and the civil society sector so that they can jointly identify possibilities how to join resources and invest them in sustainable development. In this context, speaking of investments for the environment, if we see the broad framework of the SDGs, one of the key principles is leave no one behind. That is, everything that we are doing from the aspect of the SDGs, first of all, should serve those who are most vulnerable in the society. Because if we invest only in major projects or highly profitable projects, we only increase the inequalities and differences in the society, and that we need to find a way how this finance that we talk about, both public and private, can be brought closer to the groups in the society that are lagging behind in the rural areas, in small communities, vulnerable categories of citizens. What Mr. Bishop mentioned as an initiative to support the startups of young people is actually can be considered in this regard. I really greet the efforts of Sparkasse Bank, but I would like to hear for the bank in the banking sectors, are there any long-term strategic approaches in order to bring the financial services or the banking sector closer so that the banking sector can start empowering vulnerable categories through innovative instruments or initiatives? Are there any plans of this kind? I will give you a brief answer. As you already mentioned, that will require working together of various stakeholders. For the banks, it is important that all groups of citizens have equal access to finance, including the vulnerable categories. Therefore, I can tell you that all banks are giving huge priority to bringing their services closer to all citizens. We are also witnessing the overall digitalization of banking services. We invite you to join us in the new initiatives taken by the Economic Chamber of North Macedonia, where all institutions are included, including banks, young people, because we have new startup businesses projects, also about innovation, further qualification, education, etc., and we are at your disposal. Thank you very much. I think now it's time to close this panel. To sum up, but also to add to what Nikita said, I can recognize a positive energy that key stakeholders in the society, and especially in the private sector, gradually are shifting towards reaching the SDGs and also providing adequate finance, which was actually the topic of today's discussion. Of course, we will welcome all the efforts taken by the central bank that is taking specific steps in this regard, but also steps taken by the bank and the financial institutions. That is all their positive efforts towards responsible banking. Of course, not everything has been exhausted in this regard, but we also had limited time. We couldn't include other financial institutions, but banks and all other financial institutions should definitely strengthen or enhance their efforts to include sustainability as one criterion for investment. And finally, we also have the companies. This was something that was discussed together with Ms. Nanush. Companies will have quite a work ahead of them in terms of adjusting their basic business models, how to involve aspects of good environmental, social, and corporate governance. That is to shift their investments towards clean, energy efficient, not polluted projects, good relations with suppliers, employees, and also to ensure good and transparent governance with their companies. And that all the aspects that Ms. Nanush mentioned will be of great assistance. Thank you all for your attendance and participation in the annual UN conference. And I do hope that we shall continue actively discussing topics that were raised today at the conference. Thank you.